Morning. Great to see all of you. Thanks for having me back. It's been a few years. I think it was 2019. It was right before the world changed. A year before everything kind of fell apart and things changed and the world got a lot different. But I was blessed to be able to be with you in 2019. I had held a couple meetings. In fact, the first meeting I think I ever held was in the old building. Yeah, I'm that old, by the way. So thank you for sharing this opportunity with me. Bible classes are timed events, so I'll have comments. I got a lot to say about Jamie, just not right now. Later I'll do that, but way later maybe. But this morning, let me just get started because I got a lot of things I want to share with you. And we got about 30 minutes to do it. So let's just jump into our study. This is going to be the first text. I kind of forgot that was if there's a Bible reading. So let me go ahead and open your Bibles there, and I'll get to it here in just a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about why this series. Oh, that's not working, by the way. So I'll just use the screen for now. But I'm sure it's. Oh, yeah, it's definitely on. There it went. Okay. There. All right, we'll get it right in a second. But let me tell you the genesis of this. That's no pun intended. But let me tell you the genesis of this particular study, and then I'm going to weave it into some things I want to do this week. But my son, when he was, I think he was maybe a senior. My oldest was a senior at WU. He was an engineer. He's a computer engineer, electrical engineer, but he had to take electives, and some of those electives had to be in humanities. And he ended up taking this philosophy class. He had to take it. He had to take some class in the humanities. So he takes this class. And a couple weeks into the class, the professor gets in front of the group and he says, listen, he says, who would like to have an automatic A, never show up to class again? Every hand goes up, right? Yeah, that sounds good to me. Tell me how it is I can get an automatic A in the class, never have to come back to class again. And the fellow said, simply bring me a recording of the voice of God. Now, what a trapping, baiting, right? Well, there was not a serious effort to make any real conversation, right? That was an effort to belittle. That was an effort to belittle the Creator. That was an effort to belittle those who had any conviction or belief in the Creator. It was an effort not to actually challenge thinking, but it was simply a ploy to try to make a point. But Sam's not that kind of kid. He doesn't take a challenge lightly. And so he got to thinking about it. And he called me and he's like, let's do this. Let's figure out a way to try to convince this professor that we do have, in essence, the recording of the voice of God. And so that got us to thinking about that idea of, do we have the voice of God? And in what form do we have the voice of God? And how reliable is that voice if we have it? And so that's how this whole series of thoughts came to be when it comes to trying to hear the voice of God. So let's jump into that narrative that I shared with you on the opening slide. Go to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. And there's lots of things. Let me fly through it. I'm going to get to verse 27. But just work with me here for a second. Beginning in verse 3. Then God said. Verse 6, then God said. Verse 9, then God said. Verse 11, then God said. Verse 14 rather, then God said. Keep going, right? It just keeps going. Verse 20, then God said. All the way through Genesis chapter 1, throughout the entire creative process. Do you understand the power that is being wielded by the God of the Bible, where His mere voice can say, light be, and there was light? That's the God of the Bible, and His voice has been heard and recorded ever since. Now, before this series of studies over the next 4 days is over, we'll dive into various aspects of that. And we're going to try to give you some things that should give you some confidence that when you believe in the God of the Bible, when you appreciate the testimony of this book, when you listen to the words of Jesus, when you appreciate the things that the Bible shares with us, that they are valuable, they are important, and they are eternal. So just bear with me as we walk through several things to just build that argument, if you will. throughout the various studies that we have. But I'll just go to the end of this, right? Let me just share one example of this, what we're talking about, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. Then God blessed them, and God said, His voice is still going, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply till the earth and subdue it. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, of the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to even every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life. I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Friends, one of the greatest challenges that man has perpetrated against himself is to devalue the position God gave him on this earth. There is something peculiar about you. You are not like the dog, the cat, the fish, the tree, the herb. The herb was designed to benefit you. The vegetation of this world was to benefit man. The things that God created through His voice, through His power, were intended for our benefit. And from the very earliest moments where we hear the voice of God, we hear Him both in command and offering blessing to the world and the earth in which He created. Verse 16 of chapter 2, just jump over a page or two. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And we have the very first instance of a command, if you will. Really the only negative instruction ever given to man in his initial creation. One warning. See that tree right there? Don't eat of that. And just like many children that we've experienced in our days, if you have children, the very thing you told them, don't touch it. You could touch these 172 other things, but don't touch that one. And which one are they going to? That one. And that's exactly what man did. God says, see that tree? Eat that one. See that fruit over there? Go ahead. It's all yours. See those herbs? Dig them. They're yours. See all these things? All of it. It's all for you. Just don't touch that one. And Satan enters the picture, tells him that subtle difference. You'll not really die. And the consequences come. My point, friends, this morning in this study is simply this. From the very beginning, God spoke. And we have the recording of His voice. We have the record of the voice of God and what He said and why He said it. But the Bible's not done sharing that thought with us. Jump over to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, and let's look at this situation with Moses here in Exodus chapter 3. Begin with me in verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him. We have an occasion here. He spoke to Adam and Eve. He speaks directly to Moses here in this moment. He says to Moses, Moses, Moses. Moses says, here I am. And then he said, do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. From the earliest recordings of the voice of God, God tries to impress man that His voice, His message, His thoughts, His intents should be reverenced. Adam and Eve should have reverenced God's single negative instruction, don't eat from that tree, and yet they ignored that instruction, ate of that tree, and we're paying the price for that. They paid the initial cost of that transgression, and man has continued to pay the price for that, the death that resulted from it from that point forward. all because they chose not to reverence the voice of God. Now, Moses in Exodus 3 encounters a pretty peculiar circumstance, right? He sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And so here's this fire, and this no consume. And Moses, like you would, wants to go take a little closer look, right? He wants to go take a little closer look at a bush on fire that's not being consumed. As he draws closer, God's voice rings out. Kick your shoes off, Moses. Well, why? Because I'm present here speaking to you, and you will reverence that. That's not his words. That's the intent of his purpose. When he says, kick your sandals off, you're on holy ground. Why is it holy? Because God is there. Why should it be a reverenced moment? It's because the God of all things is in your presence, Moses. Think about his instructions, Moses, and we don't have time to dive into all of it, but Moses was concerned about the instructions to go back to Egypt, and what am I going to tell him, and who am I even going to say that sent me? Jump to verse 13. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Moses is concerned. I can't just show up in Egypt, tell, number one, Pharaoh to let the people go, and number two, tell the Israelites to follow me, if I can't convince them that the person who sent me to do that has value. I got to tell them your name. And God says, well, when you get there, here's what you're going to say. You're going to say, the I am that I am has sent you. You tell them the I am has sent you. Brother and friend, we cannot escape that reality. In 2025, it's still the same God. And when we declare Him to the ears and open Him to the eyes of the people we encounter, yes, in modern society, we cannot change, manipulate, ignore the reality. He's still the I am. That's who He is. That's who He has always been. And no matter any effort to try to rethink that, won't change what God said about Himself. And we've got to embrace that. The voice of God is recorded. And He said, listen to my commands, appreciate my blessings, reverence my voice. Ezekiel 2:2 illustrates the same thing, but let's keep moving. Notice His voice hasn't stopped. Genesis chapter 9. Let me share another example with you. Genesis chapter 9, verse 8. Then God spoke, verse 8 of Genesis chapter 9. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, spoke to Adam and Eve, speaks to Moses. Here's the recording of his voice speaking to Noah. He says, and as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark. Every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now that's a whole other conversation we could have in another time, and the importance of that symbolism of the covenant. I get that. But for this morning, I just simply want you to recognize that when God spoke, He spoke covenant. This is the arrangement, Noah, that we're going to have. This is the situation that I have created before you. This is how I intend to continue to govern over this earth that I have created. And I'm going to seal that covenant with a sign, the rainbow, that will remind you every time that you see it that we have entered into a covenant relationship. If you jump to chapter 12 in verse 1, covenant with Noah after the floodwaters descend. Now, fast forward in the history of man, God comes to a man by the name of Abram. Now the Lord had said to Abram, God spoke to Adam and Eve, God spoke to Noah, God spoke to Moses, God spoke to Abram. And we have the recording of that. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The promises and covenant made to Abraham brought to him strength and benefit and courage, ultimately, to go on and become that great nation that God had intended. When God spoke, He spoke to establish covenants. Now sometimes when God spoke in more forceful ways. In the book of Zechariah chapter 7, and in verse 4. Zechariah chapter 7, verse 4. Then the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, God spoke to Zechariah, and we have the recording of his voice. Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th month during those 70 years, did you really fast for me? For me? It's a question. When you eat and when you drink, do you not eat and drink for yourselves? Should you not have obeyed the words which the Lord proclaimed through the former prophets? When Jerusalem and the cities around it were inhabited and prosperous, and the south and the lowland were inhabited? Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, execute true justice, show mercy and compassion, everyone to his brother. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother. But they refused to heed, shrugged their shoulders, and stopped their ears, so that they could not hear. I wanted to come to this text because it does a couple of things for us. Number one, it illustrates another way that God spoke to His people. He speaks to the prophet Zechariah, and He brings rebuke and warning. But I want you to appreciate why He did that. For 70 years they had been in captivity, right? And they finally are going to get to come home. But He says basically in that 70-year period, while you were captive, rather than mourning and fasting the sin that caused this to begin with, and bringing your praise before the throne of God, asking for Him to strengthen and help and benefit you, your fasting and your mourning were pity parties. Now you say, Brian, what translation did you read that from? I read that from the West Virginia Ease translation. That's what he said, though. You didn't mourn because of what you did to God. You mourned for yourselves. You mourned because you guys didn't get what you wanted. You were mourning and sad because of the condition that you created on your own. And when you should have been looking to me, you were looking to feel sorry for yourself. Why is that important in our conversation over the next, particularly today? That problem hasn't changed. Why do men struggle with God? Why do men struggle with a comprehension, a belief, a conviction about the God of the Bible? Why do they struggle acknowledging the reverence necessary? Why do they struggle acknowledging the warnings and rebuke? Why do they struggle understanding the commands? Why are they challenged with God? And the same reason has plagued man from the start. The minute man thinks of himself rather than his God, he's in trouble. The moment it becomes about me, right? The moment the situation, the conversations is about me, because that's the way we talk about God in 2025. What do I believe about God? How do I feel about God? What do I think God is? And friends, I get it. I'm not belittling that. We've been programmed to that. Trust me, I'm being passionate about it, but I'm not being detrimental about it. I understand it because that's been the dialogue. We have been programmed, and I don't mean in some kind of nefarious way, just we've been conditioned to think about everything from our own point of view. And what God says is, if you really want to be convicted in me, you're going to have to see me through my eyes. If you want to be convicted about who I am and my commands and be convicted about my promises and reap the benefit that I have to offer to you, you're going to have to see me according to my voice, not yours. Because, friends, if we create God in our image, He won't look like the God of the Bible. If we design God to look, sound, if we create His voice to sound like our voices, He will no longer be the God of the Bible, which I'll contend in our studies this week will make Him powerless. This is the one that has power, the one who said, "Let there be light," and there was light, the one who said, "Don't eat of that tree," and when they did, they died. The one who deserves our reverence, to kick off our shoes and recognize He's the Holy One. We do have the record of the voice of God. And the Old Testament's filled with examples of that. But the New Testament does the same, by the way. The New Testament shares with us similarly the same kinds of things. But it's interesting, though, that when the voice of God is recorded in the New Testament, that His Son becomes the subject and emphasis of that voice. In Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 9. In Mark chapter 1 and beginning in verse 9. It came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately coming up from the water, He saw the heavens parting and the Spirit descending upon Him like a dove. Then a voice came out of where? Came out of heaven. The voice of God. "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." A transition occurs. In the Old Testament, God spoke to Adam and Eve, He speaks to Noah, He speaks to Moses, He speaks to Zechariah, many of the other prophets. He has very direct conversations with individuals throughout the Old Testament. That changes under the New Covenant. And most of the occasions where we have this kind of direct language about the voice of God, they are almost unanimously directed towards Jesus. When we hear it here in Mark chapter 1 in its earliest moments. And by the way, somebody check me on this. Don't take my word for it. I'm doing this based on just my own basic understanding of Bible. But I would argue, I believe, that Mark 1 is the first recording of God's voice for over 400 years. Right? He's spoken unto those prophets, including Zechariah, those latter prophets in relationship up until the time that He has said, I'm done communicating until my Son comes. 400 years, He quit talking. Now you might go back and say, well, some of the things relating to the birth of Jesus, maybe there's some voice there too, right? There's some moments, but it's interesting, right? But again, that would be pointing to Jesus. That would be pointing to Jesus. Go back to Matthew 17. Notice how He uses His voice to exalt His Son. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, His brother, and led Him up on a high mountain by themselves, and He was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became as white as the light. And He beheld Moses and Elijah, other men, mere men, that God had spoken to. And He appeared to them, talking with them. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to have been here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Pause real quick. I love Peter here, by the way. He's a little overzealous. You know, he probably isn't thinking this through as much as he should. He probably should have pushed the pause button, give it a thought, and recognize what he was actually seeing. But he's right. That's who he is. He's energetic. He loves to do things. He wants to serve. And he says, "This is awesome. We need to build 3 tabernacles, one for each of you." But notice the response of God. While He was still speaking, sometimes God is trying to interrupt the voice of man so that his voice can be clearly heard. Think about that. Don't look at your wife or your husband. Don't raise your hand. Just look at me. Have you ever finished your spouse's sentence and weren't even halfway close to what they were actually trying to say? You thought they knew what they were trying to say because you thought you've heard it 16 billion times before. And so you just thought, oh, I'm just going to jump to the chase here. I'm just going to finish this and I'll be done. And she'll look at you and she'll say, what are you talking about? That's not even remotely close to what I was trying. Now, Deborah never does that, by the way. She's too sweet. But isn't that what man does with God all the time? Let's do this. And God says, wait a second. Wait a second. That this transfiguration, this moment, wasn't for you to elevate Moses and Elijah to be parallel with my son. This was a moment for me to exalt my son so that he could make all man parallel with him. Think about that for a little bit. To become joint heirs with Christ. Jesus has to be exalted above all others so that he can then make all men joint heirs with him before the Father. Whew, that's another subject for another time. Got no time for that today. Let's just let that soak in a little bit with you, though. When the voice of God came, 2 Peter 1:16 is another example of that. To glorify, right? To glorify the name of the Father. Jump over with me, John chapter 12. John chapter 12. Let me share one last text. I'm going to ask you some questions. I'll come down out of here and maybe give you 30 seconds to fire away something at me. But John chapter 12, verse 27. He says, now my soul was troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. I want to have the heart of Jesus. Yes, I may be hurting. I'm in a sorrowful state or condition. These things I'm about to suffer are horrible, Lord. I don't want to do this. But I want to glorify your name. This voice, Jesus says in verse 30, Jesus answered and said, this voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. God's voice in the New Testament does all that it can to glorify and elevate Jesus. Through the prophets, through Jesus, God's voice is recorded. So let me ask you a couple questions as we finish up in the last couple of minutes here. So let me ask you this. Do all historical figures require a voice recording to be evidenced as real? What say ye? And you're allowed to answer me, by the way. I'm on the floor. Not when I'm up there, I guess, but down here you're allowed, I suppose. The answer to that's what? Say it. No. No. Let me ask you this. That was odd. As I hit that button, I thought you've wired me clear into the light system. How do we know that George Washington was real? Yeah. And that wrist, do we have a voice recording of George Washington? No, I think 1860-ish is when, I think that's right, is when voice recordings started. Go back and check me on that. I did a quick check on it when I was doing this study, but didn't write it down. So go look that up. But well after George Washington. Well after George Washington were there abilities to, and that's even in our own American history, right? We're not even talking the days of Jesus. We're not even talking 33 AD. We're talking about a few hundred years ago. And we don't have the voice, but why do they believe it? Because people heard George Washington say this, that, and the other. Right? They know he said it, and they did what? They recorded it. They wrote it down. And you and I believe it. You and I believe it because of that. Go ahead.
It's also corroborated by multiple people.
It's well documented by multiple individuals, and our 3 studies today won't allow us to dive, but you're right. And the Bible fits that. Well documented by both those who were in it and historians who witnessed those things besides, men like Josephus and others like him. So the point simply is this, friends. The point is moot. This philosopher in this class that my son was in at the University of West Virginia was moot because he believes in George Washington, but doesn't have a voice recording for him either. 1860. I'm not as unbright as I thought. So it was 1860. Thank you. So you understand my point, right? So when we read the Bible, I'm hearing the voice of God. And what you love about the Bible, go back to your point for real quick, lots of men involved in bringing about the Bible, not only in its contents, but in its preservation over the history of it. Friends, you've got a book on your phone, on your tablet, in your hands, full of the voice of God. The question we're going to try to answer this morning and throughout our studies this week is, do I believe it? That's a harder question. That may be the harder question. And if I do believe it, do I listen to it when he speaks? That's an even more important question. That one I didn't cause, but I know what it means. Thank you for your attention this morning.